Welcome to JFK and the Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 76. It's the final full-length episode containing Gerald Custer's testimony to the Assassination Records Review Board, or ARRB, which occurred in 1997. We're getting to the end of a long wander. As I explained to you in episode 75, if you wish to skip this episode and simply hear my synopsis, then go directly to episode 77. I suspect, though, if you've listened already to all the rest of the episodes prior to this, you might want to stick around for the finale and hear from Custer himself. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 76 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.
Go back on the record.
Okay, the fixer basic job is to stop the film from developing. And it fixes the image. After it fixes the image, it goes through a wash bath. Evidently, it didn't stay in the wash bath long enough because you still have marks, fixer marks. And that was due to the old Payco units. They weren't efficient.
I'd like to point out to you edge markings and ask you whether you were able to identify any information on the edge markings.
Huh? Kodak safety.
I didn't hear you, sir.
Kodak safety.
Does that help you identify the type of film that you're holding?
Yes, it does.
Is there any reason that Kodak safety is appearing on X-ray number 9, but we have not seen it on other X-rays?
The only possible thing I can think of is they just placed it on the 14-17.
So it's the size of the film.
Correct.
The 14 by 17 is a larger film, such as the one you're looking at.
Absolutely correct.
Could we now look at X-ray number 10, please? Are you able to identify X-ray 10?
Yes, sir.
And what is that?
That's the right portion of the body.
And this was taken on the night of November 22nd, is that correct?
Sir.
Is there any question in your mind whether that's an authentic X-ray that you took on the night of the 22nd?
No question.
We now look at X-ray number 11, please. Mr. Custer, are you able to identify X-ray 11?
Yes, sir.
And how is it that you're able to identify it?
This is an additional film that I took on the abdomen.
Now, I notice there's no marker of the sort that appeared on many of the others.
Because this was a so-called repeat.
What do you mean by that?
Well, we'd like to have another film just to see if what we see is still there. Still there.
If there were metal fragments that were present in the abdomen of President Kennedy, would the appearance of the fragment be more likely after the organs are removed rather than before the removal of the organs?
No, because the metal fragments will be cut by the organs.
If the purpose of the X-rays was to locate bullets or fragments, why would X-rays need to be taken both before and after the removal of the internal organs?
You must remember the confusion at that time and that night. People were ordering this, we should take some more of there, we should take some more of that. it wasn't just one person doing it. And I'm just a E4. What I'm told to do, I do.
Can we look at X-ray number 11, please?
This is 11.
Excuse me, number 12.
Here we go. This is the lower extremities. Up, wrong way.
Are you able to identify X-ray number 12 as having been taken by you on the night of the 22nd?
Yes, sir.
How is it that you're able to identify it?
Marker, U.S. Naval Hospital, National Medical Center, left side, for the left femur, knee. You can see the contortion of the body. Here's the patella. Everything's set pretty anatomical. This knee is turned off to the side. It's externally rotated. Same thing on joint space. See a perfect joint space here. You don't.
On the anatomical level.
On the anatomical level.
Okay. We look at X-ray number 13. Are you able to identify the X-ray?
Yes, sir.
Can you tell us what it is, please?
It's AP pelvis and...
Was that taken on the night of November 22nd?
Yes, sir. And let me bring something to your attention right away. Autogram done.
Yeah. You're referring to a round circular...
this is what Dr. Ebersol stated in his testimony as a BB from a shotgun. Round circular dot. I'm sorry for interrupting you.
And you're saying that Dr. Ebersol was incorrect in that?
No, I didn't say that. I just said that he described this in his testimony.
And is it your opinion that he was incorrect?
No, I didn't say that too. I just said that he stated this was something, and I say it's done.
All right. We look at the last X-ray number 14, which is identified as the AP view of lower pelvis, hips, and upper femurs.
Right.
Are you able to identify that as having been taken on the night of November 22nd?
Yes, sir. More picture burns.
Those are the brown patches.
Brown patches. Fecal material in the colon. Brown patchy marks again. No no metal fragments.
Okay, that consists of all of the X-rays that are present in the archives on the night of the 14th. Now, you had raised previously in the deposition, have a chair if you wish, previously in the deposition possibility of some metal fragment in the C3, C4 range.
I noticed I didn't see that.
You didn't see any X-rays that would include the C3, C4 area?
No, sir.
Are you certain that you took X-rays that included the C3 and C4?
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
How many X-rays did you take that would have included that?
Just one. And that was all that was necessary. Because it showed right there.
And what, as best you recall, did it show?
A fragmentation of a shell in and around that circular exit, that area. Let me rephrase that. I don't want to say exit because I don't know whether it was exit or inlet. But all I can say, there was polar fragmentations around that area, that opening.
Around C3, C4?
Right.
And do you recall how many fragments there were?
Not really. There was enough. It was very prevalent.
Did anyone make any observations about metal fragments in the C3, C4?
I did, and I was told to mind my own business. That's why I was shut down again.
You have, during the course of this deposition, identified 3 X-rays that that you are quite certain that you took that don't appear in this collection. Are there any others that you can identify not having been included?
That's the only three that come to my mind right now, the two tangential views and the apicervical spine.
Okay.
Can I add something to that?
Sure.
And my own opinion, I do believe basically the reason why they were not here is because they showed masses amounts of bone fragments.
Did you ever hear of anyone connected with the autopsy making any attempts to remove, destroy any of the X-ray material?
Let me put it this way. Gossip is cheap. Everybody has some. I heard some, and sometimes you have to take it with a hill of beans, where it comes from. But I did hear that in a conversation.
When did you hear it in a conversation?
The next day.
What did you hear?
That certain pertinent things were taken care of.
Who told you that?
I was afraid you were going to ask that. Nobody told me. I heard it between two officers, high-ranking officers.
Who were the officers?
One was Ebersol. And one was another radiologist that right now his name just can't come to my memory.
The best of your recollection, who was it who made the statement, Ebersol or the other doctor?
Ebersol.
And the best of your recollection, what did Ebersol say?
Just what I had said.
Are you acquainted with the name of Dr. Roy Brown?
Yes, I am.
Who's Roy Brown?
He was the captain in charge of the radiology department.
Is he the other officer whom you heard speaking with Dr. Ebersol?
Yes, he was.
Did you hear a discussion about disposition of any other autopsy material in addition to X-rays?
No, I didn't.
So, for example, they did not talk about autopsy photographs?
No, I didn't. And the funny part about it was, this was on, I just happened to be walking down the hall behind them, and the conversation was going on. And I was noticed, and everything shut down. I don't like to point fingers. Gossip is cheap. I don't know, were they being truthful or what they were saying. This is just hearsay. And you know hearsay is not admissible in a courtroom.
It is admissible in a deposition, however.
I understand.
Okay, could we now look at some of the autopsy photographs? We won't look at them all. I'd like to just pull out a few of them. Could we look at the second view, which would be color photographs numbers 26, 27, or 28? Any of those three?
We're going to put this gloves back on. Is that a negative or is that a regular?
Positive color transparency. Mr. Custer, I'd like to ask you whether the image that appears on this the second view that you're looking at corresponds in a general way with what you observed on the night of the autopsy?
Yes, it is.
Do you see any differences between that photograph and what you observed on President Kennedy, such that it would lead you to question the authenticity of the photograph?
Not really. I noticed one difference. The incision on the neck is a lot bigger than what I saw. But that could be due to probing.
You're referring to the anterior neck wound,
right?
Correct. You previously identified that wound as being about the size of your small finger, is that correct?
Which makes me wonder, why would they probe it? They were looking for the fragment. Which happens to be the film that is gone. Was a message. See all this stuff here? I had rubber gloves on. I had to change 3 or 4 times.
We should look at this. Let's look at 2.
Can we look at view number 3 now, which corresponds to colors numbers 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, and 37. Color images. View 3. Mr. Custer, you're now looking at photograph number 33. I'd like to ask you whether that corresponds to what you observed on the night of the autopsy.
Yes, it does.
Is there any question in your mind about the authenticity of that photo?
Not really. See, the thing is, you're stepping in a realm here where I didn't really get involved much. But from what I saw of the body, it appears to be similar to what I saw.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
We now look at view number 6.
Hold on 1 second. Let me put this in the record. Do you notice the apparatus is holding the head? See,
yes, the metal.
It's like a metal half moon. When I took my x-rays, that wasn't there.
Does that help you identify whether you took the x-rays either before or after the photographs?
Yes.
And what would the answer be?
Well, this didn't have to be, this wasn't there. So
the metal.
The metal. So that meant that I had to take some of them before. Had to, because the only time they put that in there is when they start probing.
Why wouldn't it be possible for them to have taken that off and then you come down and take the x-rays?
That's possible too. I'm just guessing.
Okay, so
maybe I shouldn't guess.
So it's not really possible to tell by the photograph whether the x-rays are taken before.
No.
Okay. Just because you were speaking over the top of me to make sure the record's clear, let me try asking the question again. Is it possible, and I'll ask a different question, is it possible for you to determine, based upon this photograph alone, whether the x-rays of the cranium were taken before or after the photographs?
No, sir. It's not possible.
Okay. Mr. Custer, in the photograph there was a picture of it. There was a towel was included. Do you remember seeing a towel of that sort?
Mm-hmm.
You did see a towel on the night of the autopsy that would correspond to what's shown in that photograph?
Not at that time, I didn't. When I took the x-rays, there was no towel.
Was there anything there at the time that you took the x-rays?
Just a sheet over the metal.
Okay.
Over that area where the skull was. I like any body fluid.
Okay, could we take a look at the sixth view corresponding to colors photograph 42 and 43, which is identified in the record as wound of entrance in right posterior occipital region. Mr. Custer, does that photograph correspond to what you observed on the night of the autopsy?
Truthfully and honestly, I cannot remember seeing that.
Is that because you didn't have that view, or it does not appear the way that it appeared to you on the night of the autopsy?
Because it did not appear to me the way it appeared.
In what respect is that photograph different from what you recall?
I did not see the back of the skull or the lower occipital region during the time I took the X-ray.
Does that mean you didn't have a chance to observe that angle, or that the bone was not there?
I didn't have a chance to observe that angle because the head was not picked up like that, where I could see behind it. All I lifted was enough place to set underneath.
So, for practical purposes, you had insufficient opportunity of view to either authenticate or not authenticate this photograph. Would that be correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Let me add something to this. The only thing that I could authenticate is this flap right there on the right anterior portion of the skull.
It looks as if it's over the top of the ear.
Right, correct.
And you remember that flap being there?
Oh, absolutely. Here's another thing I want to add, too. Whenever you have right trauma on a skull, you have blood and spinal fluid will come out of the right ear. Vice versa, if you have left trauma, the other.
Okay. Okay, could we look at the fourth view, not going exactly in numerical order, either colors photos number 38 or 39, identified as posterior view of wound of entrance of midsole high and shoulder. Mr. Custer, during the deposition, you said that you had been able to see a wound that was on the back, President Kennedy. Does this photograph correspond to what you were able to view?
Yes, sir, it is.
And can you identify where on the photograph the wound was?
It would be on the right scapular region.
And that's the larger marking that's just to the right of the ruler.
Correct.
Is that correct? Still not on the okay. It's our understanding the House Select Committee on Assassination did some enhancements of the original X-rays, and we'd like to show you the enhancements. Have you ever previously seen the enhancements of the X-ray?
No.
What is your comment on observing the enhancements? And what we're seeing is the AP.
AP, well, I would say modified water. AP modified water. Here's the fragment again.
You're referring to the large semicircular fragment.
Right. Left marker. Right orbit. Fragments throughout. All I can say is, it's funny how the burn mark gets in the right place. And that's pretty close to what my own opinion, I believe, was an entry wound.
Are you able to identify now any brain shadows?
Very little, if any. Because you're looking at bone shadow here. Bone shadow here.
You're referring to the anatomical
Left portion of the skull. Hair on the right, anatomical and maxillary signs of the skin. Fracture marks throughout. The zygomatic arch. Mandibular arch. The left anterior portion of the skull. The superior portion of the skull. Fracture marks. Here's that irregular cut mark. What it looks like appears to me. Snaking fracture marks off to the left anatomical positioning.
I'm back on the record.
Remember you asked me a question, how come there's bullet fragments in here and you can't see? You can see them, why are they?
They appear to be more apparent in the AP than in the laterals.
You know why there's bullet fragments there? You look at the big portion of the scalp. Fragments are in the skin of the scalp. That's the only logical place they could be. They went through the brain, exploded, and went out into the scalp, perforated the scalp, impregnated the scalp. When you have a fragmented bullet, it hits, it blows, pushes everything out. When it pushes everything out, it's like somebody putting salt and pepper on your steak. It impregnates the steak. Same thing with the scalp. Because there is no brain tissue here. You can't see it. You can't determine it here because of the skull, the bony skull. You can determine, I'd love to see the lateral portion, if they enhance that. Now that in itself will be able to tell.
And? Looking for the lateral.
I've never seen it. Never.
Now looking at the enhanced lateral.
There's the effect again. See the bone? There's the fragment.
You're referring to the right above the sinus?
Right. Orbital, no, frontal sinuses, but it's still orbital ridge. It hits, fragments, and goes out. That's why this portion of the skull is out. This is out. Here's the solitaire cicada again. If there are fragments, there's very minute portions. The only reason why this isn't dark is because this is an enhancement. But you don't see any vascular markings in here. Where are they? On a normal brain, you see them in the skull. The brain has veins. It shows up. It has density. Blood has density.
So, at the time the x-rays were taken, the brain has been removed from the cranium.
Okay.
On the AP view, there was the very large fragment that was semicircular. Are you able to identify the location of that?
The only thing I can say is right there.
Could you identify where that is anatomically?
It's anterior to the sphenoid bone, which is, here's the solitaire cicada. I would say it's anterior. No, superior. Okay, can't say it's the anterior. This is
principally superior to the
cella thoracica. You can't. The only way you can go
on a graph
right. You have to take, like I explained. I have to explain to you. There's only one way you can find out the depth of a bullet is by taking a special study. It's called tomography, linear tomography, or transpiral tomography. Linear tomography is when they take different fulcrum spots, X-rays, and where the X-rays power source will rotate from a longitudinal plane. A transpiral, which is brand new now, it's a new technology, it spirals, and you change the fulcrum, and you get length.
You can identify the location with precision.
Right. By that location that you have here on that fulcrum. You just see it, then it starts to disappear, and it totally disappears. And that way you can tell. This is a different projection. You're looking dead on, side view. Now if you turn it this way, you're looking in an AP projection. You're seeing the whole front.
Okay.
You remember I brought this up on the darker one? I said you can just start to see a faint image. And I brought it out on the enhancement. I have a question for you, Joe. Did your other specialists, doctors, see these enhancements?
No.
This tells the tale.
Right here. The enhancement.
Right.
Okay.
This opens the door, literally. I showed you the entrance room. There. The exit room has to be up here somewhere. If you turn this like that, what's that tell you?
Go off the record for a minute. I'm going to ask
the testimony offered by Dr. Ebersol to the House Select Committee on Assassination. For the review board records, this is marked as exhibit number MD60. The testimony was given on March 11, 1978. Mr. Custer has brought with him today his own annotated version of Dr. Ebersol's testimony. And what I'd like you to do, if you would, Mr. Custer, is to look through the testimony and any important things that you have specific knowledge of yourself that you would like to either confirm what Dr. Ebersol said or dispute what Dr. Ebersol said. I would appreciate it. I would like you to identify the page number and line number.
Okay.
Good.
All right. Okay. Ready?
Yeah.
Page 2, line 23, and 24 and 25. And, well, let's go to page 2. He states that he was acting chief radiologist at the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda. Baloney. He was a radiologist on call. There was a lot more people higher ranking than him that were staff radiologists. They all took call. He was a resident radiologist studying for his board certification, which he did not receive till the end of that year. That's one thing I had a problem with. On page 3, that was the same thing. I agreed with him on line 2, page 3, where the commanding officer called him about 6:30, and I was notified thereafter about the incoming. And this is what is fantastic, where he states, okay, page 3, lines 7 and 8. He personally carried the cassettes containing the X-rays to the X-ray department, which was on the 4th floor. Baloney. Dr. Ebersol never left the morgue. Reed and I personally carried the X-rays. There's pictorial evidence of that you have.
You're referring to the photographs that we marked as exhibits?
Correct. Absolutely correct. All right. Page 3, the bottom half, 23. Where he again says, I would like to emphasize this was a textbook wound, round, smooth, pure, pelt, you should know, raising margins, the back of the head was... Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just going through this. I'll get to that one point. It says the back of the head was missing and the regular messy wound. At the point we have a wound of entrance. Baloney.
Go off the record for a moment. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, actually, why don't we do quote on...
Okay, page 4, line 5. He quoted, we took several x-rays of the skull. True. I quoted, and I agree with him wholeheartedly there. There, in itself, he told the truth. But you only have 3 x-rays in evidence.
There's 3 x-rays of the skull.
Right. I could go through this complete and go back and forth, but all I'd be doing is become repetitious here. And Dr. Ebersol had a tendency to say one thing and turn around in midstream to change his mind and say something else. And he talks about bullet fragments on page 4, line 11, says the initial film shows an unusual metallic fragment in the skull, but no evidence of a slug or a bullet.
End quote.
Unquote. Come on. Now, I would say myself that...
I'm sorry. Back on the record. Back on the record.
At all times, Dr. Ebersol stayed within the morgue. Dr. Ebersol examined the films as I brought them back, made interpretations, got contradicted many times throughout that evening. I suggested to Dr. Ebersol what film should be taken. In his testimony, he states that there are metal fragments in there, but they are not bullets. Now that is a complete turnaround if I ever heard of it, because a metal fragment big enough to be seen has to be a portion of a bullet. Common sense would tell you that. Another thing, when Dr. Ebersol looked at these films, he took basic physics like anybody else did, and why couldn't he see displacement of the anterior portion of the skull and realize there had to be force coming from the... No, let me correct that. The posterior portion of the skull, and realize there had to be force coming from the anterior portion of the skull. He knew that. Now, he's an educated man. He has to know that. Also, in the statements he made that he couldn't recollect certain things. How many people were in the morgue at that time? Oh, come on. It was pure mayhem. The gallery was completely full. I'll show you on your exhibit
201.
201. From the right-hand portion of the gallery to the left-hand portion of the gallery. Loaded. Not considering the people that were milling around on the morgue floor there, going from pillar to post and making different notes and doing this and that, and the technicians that were working. There was definitely more than 15 people in that morgue at that time. The commotion was astronomical. The decibel level was extremely high. You had to scream at people at times. And when I'm taking x-rays, I placed an apron on to protect myself. I had to scream for these people to move when I was shooting in that direction. And it's just, he was so vague on everything that he come up with.
Dr. Ebersol.
Dr. Ebersol. And he took the x-rays at 3 o'clock in the morning. That's crazy. I removed the whole x-ray equipment, the x-ray machine, all the films, took them back to the department, and I went to bed. And I was woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning by Captain Braun and Dr. Ebersol commending me on my performance. And I just looked at him and I shook my hand and I said, thank you, rolled back over and went to sleep. And he was so vague on everything that he come up with. I went to, like the next morning, he states that he went to, he wanted to take the body to the morgue, from the morgue to the main department. Come on. The security was so tight around there, if you sneezed, there was somebody there wanting to know what happened. They wouldn't let the body be moved out of there at all. And he felt that the quality of the films were not as good because of the portable units. Baloney. It was the film itself, the film type. The technological advancements at that time weren't that great. Don't get me wrong, Bethesda at that time had the top stuff, so to speak. The x-ray machinery, the so-called top films, everything. But it was at that time, in '63, it was unheard of. Tomography. What is that? Nasty word? The technological advancements hadn't quite advanced that far. We didn't have CT scans. Do you realize what we could have done if we had CT'd this man? You wouldn't have had to question all these, where was this bullet, where was the depth. It would have been right there, mapped out to you. Three-dimensional CT. And he was so vague in everything that he said. Magnification. Page 6. From line 4 to 6. So after, as Dr. Ebersol quotes, so after seeing the films at the White House Annex, going back to Bethesda, and using a human skull to determine the magnification level, actually there were substantial factor changes. In the film. But he knows to get no magnification, this is part of his board certification. Everything has to be taken at 72 inches, not 44 inches. And when this was all taken at 44 inches that night, which causes magnification. This was supposed to be a radiologist that knew what he was talking about. I have to disagree with him wholeheartedly. And another thing I couldn't get over, the way he was treated. He was carried around on a silk pillow by his colleagues. We don't want to step on your feet out there.
What I'd really like to do is avoid comments about that. But
that's fine.
What you observed and what he commented on, and whether it's accurate or not.
Well, let me go through this real quick. Line 21. Do you have any independent recollection of... Oh, wait, no, let me go back. No, make that 20. Dr. Bynum. Now, when you say repeats, were x-rays repeated after the autopsy started? Do you have any recollection? Dr. Ebersol, the second group of x-rays were taken either before the incision was made or very shortly thereafter. He sounds pretty confused to me. He's not sure what. And we proved today there were some taken before and there were some taken after. I can't remember what pages on what section it's on, but he made the statement. He was questioned to the fact, were there any controlling facets or factors in the gallery that controlled the morgue procedure at that time? No, there were not. Come on. There were two men that constantly stood up, directed which way things would go.
That's the general you referred to.
The general and the plainclothes, which, by deduction, I assumed that was Kennedy's personal position.
Admiral Berkeley.
Admiral Berkeley. Page 15. Line 20. He's saying how many gunshot wounds that he looked at during his career, 20 to 25. That doesn't make an expert by any means. We had radiologists there.
Just once again,
sure.
What I'd like to do is to avoid commenting on that.
Okay.
Just what you observed that is incorrect from what he observed, not his qualifications.
All right, I'm stepping over the bonds again. Pretty much that's it. I'd be going through constant repetition on this. What I can do is I can leave this one that I went through and made statements on with you, and if you want to mimeograph it out, that's fine. If you don't, you can do that too.
I would like to go back to page 5 if we could,
sure.
Which was, there's an issue that you partly mentioned after we looked at the x-rays and that we also discussed while looking at the x-rays. And these were the pencil drawings on x-ray number 2.
Which line is it?
You look at page 5, right, starting on line 19.
All right.
Where he says he may have drawn lines on the film. Does that help refresh your recollection or change your mind at all about whether you saw him actually make lines on the film?
He did draw lines.
Lines during the time of the autopsy.
He did draw lines during the time of the autopsy.
And you saw those?
I saw those.
I think that's all that we have. We'd like to thank you very much. We will be sending to you a copy of the transcript, which you'll be able to review and make corrections on, send back to us, and we will send you a copy of the final transcript as well. So thank you very much for your time and patience.
Now we off the record?
Concluded.
Yes, you sure? Now we off the record?
Yeah.
You win.
Thank you for listening to episode 76 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and The Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 77. Listening to Gerald Custer took 4.5 episodes, so it does qualify in my own mind as a wander. You might be exhausted, maybe even a little annoyed at me for doing that, or just confused, or maybe you might just be delighted and happy that I did take us on that little trip. Either way, it was definitely not a small wander, and I do appreciate that you took the time to go with me, especially during the busy holiday season. Episodes 72, 73, 74, 75, and 76 contained close to the complete deposition that Gerald Custer gave to the ARRB in 1997. I really did give you a head fake in episode 72 when I told you I was going to edit out portions of the deposition to make it shorter and more manageable. Ultimately, I did do that for the initial portions of episode 72 only, but then nothing after that, as I ultimately decided that it would be best for you to hear most all of it, taking out only some door slams and long pauses and other annoying background noise contained in the recording, but leaving all the conversation in. This deposition is one of the few that was recorded on audio tape and not just transcribed. So all the intonations of his voice, the humor, the cynicism, and he is a colorful character, it was all there, as tedious as it was to listen to all of it. Well, you just got to hear as much detail and as much candid discussion as there is in this case, and it was a set of episodes that covered an important and complex topic, the radiology exam, which was, truthfully, central and key to making a forensic determination about the wounds that President Kennedy suffered and where they really came from. If there was one group of evidence that could do that, well, the radiology exams, along with the photographs, were it. And of course, they were all just hidden away for a long time. I have to believe they were hidden on purpose, and not just for Kennedy family privacy concerns. And if you have ever stared at an X-ray, and because I have been in the hospital business for a very long time, of course, I have stared at an X-ray, well, one thing I can tell you is that unless you are an expert in reading them or you are someone with extensive experience doing them, as Custer was, he had more than 35 years' experience, by the way, at least at the time of his testimony, most of the time you won't really know what you are looking at. The radiologist in this case was Dr. Ebersol, for whom Custer worked. And while Ebersol on the stand sounds impressive, you will hear him starting in episode 78. The undertone, though, of Custer's testimony leaves you with some, let me just say, doubt about the good doctor, Dr. Ebersol. And it may be more than just some doubt, depending on how you interpreted what you heard from Custer and how much you believed of what you heard. If Custer is to be believed, Ebersol deliberately was involved in the fabrication of evidence, instructing Custer to do so. So, if that is true, game over when it comes to Ebersol. Listening to Gerald Custer directly was hearing it from the horse's mouth, It was the longest series of episodes focused solely on one witness that I have done yet. And in my mind, there is no better deposition to hone in on that is available in an audio form. So if you got bored and took my advice at the beginning of episode 75, you may have opted out of listening to episodes 75 and 76, which were the last two episodes that contained some of his testimony. Personally, I hope that you did not do that, but if you did, I completely understand. And that is what this episode 77 is all about, to try and summarize what happened and what we heard and learned, and to help us try and make sense of it all with some very real and very substantive takeaways from Gerald Custer. And there are quite a few, to be candid about it. So if you were a dutiful listener to episodes 72 through 76, well, maybe you already have it all figured out. And if that is the case, you may just want to skip me here in this episode 77 and go directly to episode 78, where we start listening to John Ebersol, who, as I said, was Custer's direct supervisor that night. You might have it all down pat if you were able to listen closely enough, like me. Well, there were so many points in Custer's testimony that I had to listen to the entire 3.5 hours 4 times and write all the points down in a notebook in order to keep track of them all. I'm hoping you won't skip this one either, because I like talking to all of you, and you may like to hear my perspective and summary on it too. But either way, I'm good with whatever you decide. So, without further ado, let's listen to episode 77 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Let's jump right in and try to summarize what we learned from Custer's testimony that is noteworthy. Probably first and foremost is Custer's confirmation that the autopsy was nothing more than something that had to be done, but that it did not have to be done correctly. And just about everything that he saw that night and was able to describe to us seems to reinforce that conclusion. In his own words, it was not an autopsy that was being done to implicate something unknown, so to speak. As he would say, again, in his own words, about the idea of trying to find facts through the autopsy, his words on that topic simply were, forget it. Now, that is a judgmental conclusion on his part and less based on direct and tangible facts. But it's important to start with that tonight because it is an overarching theme of the evening. And in his defense, Custer does have plenty of factual details that we will get to in a moment that clearly support the idea that evil was present that night at the autopsy. The next takeaway is that Custer was adamant that the autopsy was being directed by 2 men who were in the gallery that night at the morgue. One of them was an unidentified 4-star general that was either Air Force or Army, but the gentleman was not an admiral. Custer was familiar with the uniform of an admiral, and the man he points out here was not a Navy man. He was sure of that, and he clearly identified this man as having 4 stars running down his arm on his uniform. This 4-star general was directing the autopsy along with a second individual that was not a military man. And given his understanding of certain medical aspects, particularly his knowledge of the myelogram, well, Custer surmised that this second private individual was the president's personal physician, which, as we know, was Admiral Berkeley, who was, of course, an MD. Custer did not identify either of these 2 men by name. He didn't know them. That does seem strange that he did not try and subsequently understand who they were, their names. Even years after the fact, when he began to interact at least some with some of the JFK assassination research community. We also learned that Custer clearly said these 2 men, including the general, were barking orders all night long and at various times throughout the autopsy, apparently giving these orders to all who were directly involved in performing autopsy steps, or at least to Humes, Boswell, and Fink. Custer cited particular circumstances where these two men gave orders to go no further, or don't do this, or don't do that. Very demonstrable direction and intervention in the autopsy itself. And they would at times invoke the Kennedy family name. A good example of this is when Dr. Ebersol put one of the initial skull films on the viewing box and began to make pencil marks where he saw bullet trajectories. He was immediately admonished not to do that. Custer would go on to describe the involvement of these two autopsy overseers as more cohesive with the gallery instructions once Fink got there and became actively engaged with Humes and Boswell. But in Custer's view, the aim of this intervention was clear, and he answered, when asked the questions, he answered that it was not done in the name of concern around disfigurement of the body during the autopsy. He implied that it was done to impede the process or to obscure the results of the autopsy. Again, back to his central conclusion that the autopsy wasn't meant to find the true facts. In the third takeaway, Custer points out that there was a chaotic scene in the morgue itself during the time the autopsy was conducted, contrasting it to the quiet, methodical environment that forensic pathologists would normally work in when performing an autopsy. He paints a picture of it, and this is his word to describe it. It was mayhem, with a stream of phone calls coming into the morgue during the autopsy itself, including calls from what he describes as downtown Washington, and also calls from Dallas. One has to wonder who was on the other line from Dallas, and if such calls from Dallas indeed really did come in. Did he talk to any of the Dallas doctors that night? Was that one of those calls? We don't know, because many of the follow-up questions that should naturally have been asked of him by the lawyers as he left these tidbits, these hanging chads out there, were completely missed by Jeremy Gunn and others who were doing the interrogation. So as I personally sat there listening to these tapes more than once, I cried out for the ask and the answer that never was. The interrogators had their defined questions, and they were working hard to keep Gerald Custer from wandering. Understandably so, because he was a wanderer, for sure. But those wanders should have been allowed to happen. The interrogators would have learned a bit more if they had been more patient with them and attentive to them. Well, anyway, back to the phone calls from Dallas. If those calls were not from the doctors from Dallas, then who else would possibly be calling from Dallas, and what would be the nature of any conversations that were so important that they had to be undertaken with the autopsy doctors directly at that very moment during the autopsy? Think back to the back wound on this one and the connection to the throat wound. The fourth point is that, for the most part, Custer believed that the x-rays being shown to him during this 1997 deposition were indeed the originals that he took, because he took all the x-rays himself that night. And this is important since there has been so much speculation about whether any of the x-rays were doctored or that other x-rays were substituted for the real ones after the fact. Indeed, Custer revealed the existence of his own crude metal instrument with holes in it that he used routinely for unique identification within x-rays, sort of his personal signature to show that any particular film was one that he took. Custer would include this crude metal object in the x-ray by placing it somewhere in camera view in the vicinity of the area being radiographed. And the presence of this metal instrument showing up in the x-ray is one factor that actually helped Custer to verify that the x-rays in question, the ones that were shown to him during the deposition, were indeed x-rays taken by him that night at Bethesda. And he was able to answer that question throughout the review on multiple occasions related to various x-rays that he was shown. And he did it with a great deal of confidence as the interrogators asked him about the authenticity of each x-ray. But there were some x-rays that did not have this unique identifier on them. We'll get to those in a moment and why. That was the good news on the x-rays, but here is the bad news on the x-rays. Some of the skull x-rays are indeed missing from the National Archives. Custer confirmed that. And here's some important details on that. Custer took the skull films first, and there were a total of 6 skull x-rays that were taken. He methodically went through the ones that he took. All 6 were taken in that first filming session, probably right around 7:30 or 8 o'clock that night, as they got started. But the 2 oblique or tangential views were now missing from the National Archives by the time that Custer was deposed. Custer confirmed that these 2 missing x-rays were indeed taken by him that night. They were taken from the vantage point that would allow you to look from above and down into the head so that the direction of travel of the bullets would be clear. Imagine in your mind what that x-ray would have shown. How revealing such an x-ray would be regarding the angle that the bullet entered the head and then traveled. Just like a drone looking down on a highway from above, the path and the direction of that bullet or bullets was revealed by that view of the x-ray. And these fragments that were identified were traveling from anterior right to posterior left, supporting a shot which entered from the front. These x-rays, in Custer's opinion, were further proof that there was a bullet that entered the front right and that the resulting fragments traversed to the back and to the left, producing an ever-widening conical shape as they shredded brain tissue and as they plowed further through and into the brain. And the only logical conclusion, from Custer's perspective, was that these fragments produced this type of damage as they moved from front to back. And again, in Custer's technical opinion, the entrance and direction was reinforced by the expanding conical shape that the bullet fragments left as they took their path. In his view, it was a characteristic that happens with bullets as they enter and begin to traverse. Really, this is big news, as it means that the 2 x-rays that clearly showed damage supporting a front entrance wound to the head, a wound which traversed from front to back and not from back to front, those 2 x-rays were radiographed by Custer and they were now missing. And he confirmed that. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. Custer was an x-ray tech, and at 35 years of experience by the time his testimony was taken, he was undoubtedly more knowledgeable than he was back on that night in 1963, especially after spending a great deal of time at UPMC in Pittsburgh, which is a very large and very sophisticated health system. But still, he chronicles how he saw these things then, and that he made earnest attempts right then, that night, to point them out to Dr. Ebersol. And he was told to just shut up and do his job. Right from the start, Custer was dropping bombshell facts. This next one is fantastic. When he picked the body up to take pictures of the torso, the lumbar spine, and the pelvis, a large-sized bullet fragment about 3 to 4 centimeters in length, which is about 1.5 inches long, fell on the table out of President Kennedy's back. He stated that Dr. Fink then picked it up with a pair of forceps, and that was the last time he saw that fragment. That is a pretty fantastic story, and it adds even more mystery to the back wound. Next, an even more fantastic revelation is the story that Custer told about the falsification of a couple of key x-rays, a fabrication that occurred early the following morning on Saturday. It relates to the x-rays taken of the skull fragments that had been delivered to the autopsy room from Dallas. Custer was ordered that Saturday morning to tape bullet fragments to one side of those skull fragments and then take x-rays of them. He states that Dr. John Ebersol, his superior, ordered him to do it, and Ebersol told him to keep his mouth shut about it. And he said that to Custer in no uncertain terms. And this happened just after Ebersol had come back from what was described as a Secret Service briefing at the White House. That sounds nefarious, doesn't it? Obviously, those x-rays of the late-arriving skull fragments showed the presence of bullet fragments, metal fragments on the inside of the skull. Those pieces of skull were blasted out as a result of the head wound, pieces that were from the upper rear portion of the head. So, if one were to find metal fragments there on the interior of those skull pieces, That would clearly and rather conveniently become corroborating evidence on where the headshot entered the brain. That is, from the rear. Custer was telling us this story, which turned out to be about the false manufacture of more evidence that supported a rear head wound entry. Bullet fragments found right there on the inside of those particular pieces of skull fragment. They were one of the compelling reasons that the autopsy physicians were able to conclude that the shots came from the back. It was one more important supporting detail that those particular skull fragments, when pieced together, supposedly had beveling on the inside of those pieces. Well, when you brought them all together like pieces of a puzzle, the good doctors concluded that such beveling on the underside of those skull fragments, if it did exist, that was strong evidence of an entry wound. And so the bullet fragments found on the underside of those same pieces of skull would be the icing on the cake. Icing that solidified that the wound in question in that area, in the top back of the head, was the point of a rear entry. But what Custer was essentially saying to us was that these were doctored x-rays, and they were evidence that was manufactured for that purpose, to reinforce the evidence that the shot came from the rear. It was that plain and simple. Quite startling for sure, but still a plain and simple fact that Ebersol, and who knows who ordered Ebersol, but whoever did, manufactured evidence to bolster the narrative of a fatal shot coming from behind, conveniently lining up with the lone gunman theory already in place by the start of the autopsy. Custer wasn't sure why they did that, at least not at that moment, and he asked why. And Ebersol told him that the x-rays were to be used as part of the making of a bust of the president. We know now that there were plenty of other good x-rays of Kennedy's head that were on file at Bethesda at the time, from previous medical work that had been done on the president. So this explanation for its need was highly dubious. This discussion has been highly touted in conspiracy books, and I wonder if Custer got it from there first, or was it that Custer is telling the truth and it's the other way around? I tend to believe that Custer is credible here and he is telling the truth. He had something to say about the throat wound, too. When asked about any observations he might have of it, and what he said in deposition was pretty controversial, he described the wound in the anterior throat area as a typical bullet hole that he estimated was a little bit bigger than his little finger in dimension. Now, that clearly implies that such wound was an entrance wound. And at the time he first looked at that wound, he did not observe a long slit that might have represented the tracheostomy. Recall the long, wide, gaping hole that is so evident in the autopsy photograph that has become emblematic of that wound. Custer simply said that such a wound did not exist at the outset of the autopsy, and that possibly it was elongated later in the process of probing the wound. But that was conjecture on his part. Again, this one is a little confusing to me. The application of that tracheotomy incision must have produced some distortion of the wound, although other doctors have testified that a typical tracheotomy slit would not have significantly expanded the wound itself. So maybe, in fact, Custer's recollection is accurate on this one. These goings-on were fantastic, all right. So how did the folks in authority that night keep the lid on this? How did the secrecy clauses come into play? Well, Custer identified 3 distinct incidents over the course of the night of the 22nd and the day of the 23rd where he was told in no uncertain terms to keep quiet. And that would have been the nicest version of delivery of that order. Custer was clear on how clear that Ebersol was on this point. As Custer describes it, Ebersol made it perfectly clear that he was not to speak, and Custer quoted Ebersol as saying on, I think, more than one occasion, "Keep your mouth shut." The next day, on Saturday, and after Ebersol came back from a White House briefing, the one I just mentioned, well, at that time, he made it clear again, and Ebersol told Custer that, this time, it came from a very high level, and that Custer was not to talk about anything related to the autopsy with anyone. and that, if he did, he would be very sorry. Let's pause on that one. I think that constitutes a real threat. I'm just saying. The third encounter in warning was the most dramatic in Custer's eyes. It was after he signed the actual order of silence on Saturday morning, which Custer refers to as a gag order. The officers present in the commander's office at that moment told him that if he talked, it would be the sorriest day of his life, and that he would spend some time behind bars. They had armed MPs standing by the doors of the commanding officer's office, where this whole thing took place, and Custer states that he thought those MPs standing outside the door of the commander's office were for intimidation purposes, as he and others were being given the order to sign the secrecy order. And the or else part of that conversation was that, at least he felt, that he wasn't getting out of that office, unless they signed the secrecy document right then. Otherwise, he was going to be hauled off by the MPs and going somewhere that he implied would not be very nice. We know, based on the totality of his testimony, that Custer had a diminished view of Dr. Ebersol, and on various occasions he reiterated that Ebersol was not a leader. Custer thought that Ebersol deferred leadership and looked to Custer himself for it during the autopsy, at least as it related to the taking of x-rays. Custer did all the work when it came to the taking of these x-rays, and to top it off, Ebersol was still dismissive of the technical conclusions that Custer was making and verbalizing to Ebersol as they were reviewing the x-rays. That may have felt personal to Custer. As Custer put it right at the outset of the deposition, that he had a certain amount of expertise that he felt Ebersol should have acknowledged, and he didn't. Custer described Ebersol as a man that loved the limelight and loved to take credit for things, but he was not willing to take the heat. In the end, Custer would reiterate that Ebersol was a follower and not a leader, and that Ebersol was on board with whatever the company line was, so to speak. Ebersol was going to do what those in charge told him to do. This is one man's opinion, of course, and his feelings about Ebersol did not seem to be situational. In other words, he wasn't painting a picture that Ebersol had, up to that point in life, been a fine leader and an independent thinker, and then, in the weight of this heavy moment and event, just succumbed. Rather, to the contrary, Custer seemed to imply that because of Ebersol's demonstrated attributes, Custer was perhaps not surprised by all of Ebersol's actions. He didn't say it that way, but that was the impression that I got based on the cumulative statements that he made about Ebersol during his testimony. Shortly after the incident where the two x-rays were fabricated, Custer described a circumstance where he was walking down the hallway and overheard a conversation between Dr. Ebersol and another radiologist, a doctor who turned out to be Roy Brown. He overheard the two of them discussing the Kennedys' case, and that Dr. Ebersol was seeming to say that certain pertinent things had been taken care of. As soon as the two men realized that Ebersol was coming into earshot territory, the conversation seemed to cease. Under direct questioning by the attorneys, Custer was commendable because he said he heard many rumors, and they were just that, rumors, not verifiable, and while he stated and acknowledged their existence, he was reluctant to comment on them. Rumors that things had been taken care of, so to speak, and what all that meant. Surprisingly enough, the attorneys knew of this conversation in the hallway already, or somehow made a good guess as to who it was, and they asked Custer point blank if it was Dr. Roy Brown, after Custer had initially declined to identify who that second party was that was talking to Ebersol. Once the attorneys did that, to their good credit, by the way, and they offered up the second name of Roy Brown, Custer confirmed and agreed that it was indeed that person. Roy Brown was actually the head of the radiology department at Bethesda at the time of the autopsy, according to Custer, anyway. And so Ebersol was actually talking to his boss in that hallway conversation. We know that other evidentiary matter was destroyed too, by Ebersol, and witnessed directly by Custer. Custer had routinely entered the request for President Kennedy's x-rays in the daily log contained in the radiology department. Ebersol directed Custer to tear out the entire page on which the entry was made. He gave it to Ebersol, and Ebersol destroyed it. He tore it up, right there in the presence of Custer, and when Custer asked why, the response from Ebersol was that it simply was, and I quote, "none of your business." So why would Ebersol do that? X-rays being ordered for the president, obviously routine and certainly not revealing of anything substantive, even from a privacy perspective, at least on the surface. If one believes that additional X-rays were to be taken, possibly substituted or added, such as the ones that contain the bullet fragments attached to the scalp fragments, then one can begin to understand why they wanted no entries in the radiology logbooks. Because if they were going to substitute secretly made autopsy X-rays or altered X-rays, it might look odd to someone investigating if the original batch was on record as being made in the logbook, and then subsequent batches absent from the listing log would be inconsistent with how the first batch was handled. Their absence then would bring suspicion. So being able to say that none of them were listed in the log makes any type of alteration or substitution of X-rays easier and without conflict within the log itself. It seems to me as if that was exactly what was going on here, in light of the X-rays made of the skull fragments taped to the metal fragments. On the other hand, they very easily could have gone the other way, putting them all on the log, unless they were keeping their options open for even more chicanery at a later date with the X-rays. This is one for you as a juror to get a feel for. Custer also describes a moment at which Ebersol realizes that Custer was using his personalized metal device to make a personal identification mark on the X-rays, and he ordered Custer not to do that anymore. Not so nefarious, really, as any standard protocol today would prohibit that, I think. But it seems potentially more nefarious in this case during this time frame. And I wonder how much experience in the past that Ebersol and Custer had together, working together, because if this was a practice that Custer routinely applied and Ebersol was aware of from previous moments in time and saw no objections to it previously, it might draw more attention to an assassination researcher that Ebersol was now objecting to the practice. But this we will probably never know. Custer was asked about who was taking notes that night, and he answered pretty crisply that Boswell and Humes had simple black books that they were taking notes in. But sadly, the lawyers never pressed that. There has never been any discussion in the record about whole black notebooks being used for note-taking by these two doctors. So with all the hullabaloo about the destruction of autopsy notes, it is surprising that, again, the lawyers didn't seize on this statement to try and learn more or ascertain the level of note-taking. Did they have 10 pages of notes or just one? How much writing were they doing? Custer finally did remember seeing Seibert and O'Neill taking notes as well, and he had a glib comment about that he could swear that they were writing a book because they were writing down notes about everything. Again, not sure how he was able to retain their names so clearly, but then not know who was directing things in the gallery. But they all were sworn to secrecy, and maybe the FBI guys announced themselves, like a Broadway act. Hi, we're Seibert and O'Neill. Makes it easier to remember our name. Okay, I'm being glib here, but the delivery of their name by Custer in such a matter-of-fact way, it makes me believe that he heard much about Seibert and O'Neill in his intervening 35-year period between the autopsy and the deposition. He would also go on to say that one of them, he wasn't sure which one of them, followed him up to the radiology processing area where Custer was developing the X-ray films, and the FBI agent wanted to enter and watch them being developed. But Custer would not let him in. Not terribly relevant to our story, but one more interesting detail of what went on that night. And the FBI's probably earnest objective to make sure they watched the chain of evidence related to those X-rays. I'll give them a rebuttable presumption of good on that one. Custer used a bulky old portable GE unit that was on wheels, but wasn't as portable as the portable X-ray machines of today. It was frankly quite difficult to maneuver, and its bulkiness caused at least one X-ray to be cut off. But he disagrees with the later testimony of Ebersol that the unit was less capable inherently of taking a good radiograph. Rather, they did use different film in those portable units, and that did affect the overall quality of X-rays produced with that machine. It is a machine that, for sure, now you would find in the Smithsonian, as he described it, as an antique of sorts that now punctuates the rapid advance in radiology filming that has occurred in the some 60 years since that moment. The true irony is that with the current 3D CT scan technology, most of these lingering questions about bullet trajectory and what was in the brain and where would likely have been easily answered by use of the modern technology that we have today. Unfortunately, it was still 1963. The first X-rays they took were skull films, and they used a modified Waters position of the body because of the unstable circumstance of the head and the fact that rigor mortis was already setting in. Modified Waters is a technical position of the head when taking a film. He emphasized that all the radiology films were taken from the anterior side, as there was no way that they could have turned the body over given the head's unstable position. This is relevant because, as you know, any pictures that would have been taken if you were trying to determine the existence of bullets or bullet fragments through the X-rays, bullets or fragments that entered from the rear and therefore were probably closer to the rear and would have been better revealed by an X-ray taken from the posterior side of the body. Well, the odd thing is that they did take photographs of the president's back, so what is up with that? At some point, they must have turned the president over to be able to do that. So that is a confusing statement by Custer that should be explored. There's probably an easy answer, I just don't get it. One thing is for sure, his description of the president's skull and its condition is nothing less than chilling. And it would seem to me to be a compelling reason for limiting movement of the body during the autopsy. Custer described it as if someone had taken a hard-boiled egg and rolled it in their hand. There were just fractures everywhere, and the skin was holding the skull all together, but the bones underneath were all unstable. That is an analogy that I think hits home for all of us. Most of us have rolled an egg like that in our hand at one time or another. Custer did say that there was a total of between 14 and 20 X-rays taken that night. They were taking them in groups because the film contained in the cassettes was limited to a certain number of cassettes at a time. Why that is the case technically, I don't know. But they continued to take films as directed on at least 4 or 5, perhaps even 6 occasions, and then shuttle back and forth to where the old Payco processing unit was on the 4th floor to process the films. And after completion of that task, returning each time to the autopsy room so that the films could be put back up on the view box for viewing. The first set of which was at the outset of the autopsy, and the second about 1 hour later after receiving a phone call from Ebersol and being summoned to come back to the autopsy room. One thing that has baffled me until I listened to this conversation was the simpleton's view of what brain matter was left in the brain at the time of the X-rays were taken. We know some was simply blown away by the shots, and so much of the brain matter was gone by the start of the autopsy. Without photos, it's simply left to the recollection and imagination of all who saw it, of just how much was still there and how much was really gone, and at what point was the actual remainder of the brain removed. So when Custer describes those streaks of fragments present in the middle of the brain, traversing the inside of the brain, where they would have otherwise been suspended by brain matter themselves, because that is how they still showed up on X-rays. Well, how is that the case, especially if the brain had been removed, and when much of the brain matter was gone? There was an exchange between the lawyers and Custer on this. It was a pretty plain and simple question. How was this spray of fragments captured in the X-rays if the brain matter was gone? Well, we do know that the first set of X-rays were taken of the skull when what was left of the brain was still intact before they removed what was left for later review. And on that matter, the brain was never sectioned. And if you believe Custer's story about that night, you can imagine why they decided not to do that. And it would have produced more damning evidence that there was a shot taken from the front that traversed from front to back. It would have confirmed what was ostensibly already evident in the 2 X-rays of the skull that were now missing. But that's a digression. The real question is, how does that streak of fragments show up on the X-ray? Well, Custer was somewhat baffled by that himself, and he answered very simply that those fragments were either attached to skull matter or they were still suspended in the brain matter that still remained in the skull at the time of the X-ray. That seems obvious, but I guess that is the simple answer. Custer also pointed out that the one X-ray that has an emulsion burn on it was the one where Ebersol got the film too close to the lamp. And while this was not done that often, this particular X-ray was put out of business by his little snafu. And Custer pointed out that it happens to be a burn right on the spot of the X-ray where the doctors identified more bullet fragments. How convenient. Unrelated to the X-rays, the lawyers taking the deposition went down a line of questioning about the casket. As we all know, and you will hear more in subsequent episodes about the casket, there was and still is a lot of questions being raised about the body and whether it arrived in a shipping casket instead of the bronze ceremonial casket in which it left Parkland, and whether there was something done to remove the body and do work on it before the official autopsy began. All that stuff that we have already touched upon earlier. So, related to that, there was a confusing exchange between Custer and the lawyers when they asked him to discuss the casket and his observations of the casket. One thing that was clear is that he clearly rejected the idea that the president arrived in some sort of an ordinary shipping casket there that night. He categorically rejected that. He was there in the morgue when they took the body out of the bronze casket, and he himself helped to take the body out of that bronze casket. He was explicit about that. However, as the testimony unfolded, he seemed to articulate that there were 2 well-appointed caskets there that night. One that he saw being removed from a black limousine, not a gray one, at the start of the autopsy, and then one that he saw about an hour later in the morgue cooler room as he was leaving. As you recall, the morgue cooler room is sort of an ante-room before you get into the morgue. And he saw that after taking the first set of films and as he was beginning to head back to the 4th floor to develop those films. He seemed to imply that the second ceremonial casket in the morgue was delivered after he came back to take the first set of films, but made its way there sometime before he exited through the morgue cooler room right after taking that first set of films. And he described that he saw the men taking the ceremonial casket out of the black hearse, again, not the gray one, and bringing the casket into the morgue, the one that he then helped to take the body out of. He was there when they opened the casket. One very important point of note about this moment. He said the president's body was fully clothed in a suit as they opened the casket, not nude. This is a real pause for me. I find it hard to believe that they would have redressed the president's body at Parkland for the ride to Bethesda. I don't recall that in any of the documentation I've seen before. But he is the second credible witness to say that a clothed body of the president was present at Bethesda. He described the head as being covered with some sort of plastic that must have been clear because he could see the bloody sheets underneath that were wrapped around the president's head, undoubtedly placed there by the folks at Parkland to limit the amount of blood that was spilling onto and inside the cloth linings of that casket. I think someone was thinking that at that moment, when he left Parkland, that somehow that casket might still be the one he would be ultimately buried in. Who knows about that one? The only question I had here was, did anyone at Parkland remember wrapping the president's head with an extra plastic layer around those sheets? Certainly the use of sheets around his head placed there at Parkland before closing the casket up and sending it back to Bethesda is well documented. But an extra layer of plastic? Again, I don't recall ever seeing that in anyone else's testimony. That's one to spend a few more research minutes on, I think. By someone, anyway. Custer recounts that he was told that the body went to Walter Reed Hospital first by ambulance. Sadly, this line of questioning was not pursued at all by the lawyers once the statement was made. Maybe not much more to tell here, but I think it would have been worth probing more, at least who told him that and when. He did say that, in addition to the black ambulance, which he observed them taking a casket out of at the outset of the autopsy, that later, at the end of the night, that he did see a gray ambulance too, and it was parked off to the side of the morgue entrance, but not directly positioned in front of the morgue entrance. I wonder how much all of this related to the ambulances was clouded by things he heard subsequently in life after that night, because he was confused at times, and the way he tried to correct himself was confusing to the attorneys too, and all of us listening, but especially to those attorneys who were asking the questions. He did at least once contradict himself here, saying that the first time he saw a casket was in the morgue, and then later he said that he went outside the morgue prior to the start of the autopsy and could see them removing the casket from the black and, again, not the gray ambulance. So which one of these statements of his is correct? I don't know, but those statements are conflicting, and he did not try to explain his earlier statement that he first saw a casket inside the morgue, and he did not correct that in light of the later statement. Again, I'm referring to where he saw them taking a casket first out of the black hearse. And one of the lawyers actually did call him out on that. Anyway, the takeaways are that he saw the casket coming out of a black ambulance and not a gray one. He saw the president as they opened the casket, and it was a ceremonial casket and not a shipping casket. He saw no evidence of a shipping casket, and also the president was clothed when they opened the casket, and his head was wrapped in an extra layer of what appeared to be clear plastic. And finally, there was a second ceremonial casket that appeared in the morgue cooler room sometime after he arrived to take the initial x-rays, but was apparently placed there prior to when he exited the morgue as he was on his way to the 4th floor to develop the first set of x-rays. We have to remember that Custer was really not present for all that went on in the autopsy, and we should be clear about that. After Kennedy was removed from the casket by Custer and others, and he was laid on the autopsy table, and then the first set of x-rays were taken, and the skull x-rays were taken first, Custer was then asked to leave, and he went back to the radiology area, where he waited for about an hour. As we mentioned earlier, Custer waited during that time with his student, Ed Reed, and they were accompanied by an FBI agent. After about an hour, they were summoned back to the morgue by Ebersol, who telephoned him. By the time that Custer returned, the president was nude on the table, and the typical Y incision of an autopsy was already in place. And Custer believes by that time that some organ removal had already taken place, including removal of the president's liver. But he wasn't sure of the extent of organ removal at that time. Why that is important is how it affects x-rays when attempting to locate or see metal fragments on the films, metal bullet fragments. Custer went on after his military career to work in the private healthcare sector. For my friends listening who are back in Pittsburgh, Custer may have been a Western Pennsylvania native. I think you can tell by the slight regional accent in his voice and the unique pronunciation and tense of some words used by native Pittsburghers. Yinzers, as they are affectionately called by some. Eventually, Custer went back to Pittsburgh, where he went to work for Montefiore Hospital and eventually for UPMC, or the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which is a highly respected healthcare system in Pittsburgh. UPMC is now one of the most prominent regional hospital and healthcare systems in the country, with international operations as well. I am sure that both the training and experience he received there was exemplary. But I will reiterate that in the deposition, he was speaking to the group after accumulating some 35 years of experience. He had less than 5 years of X-ray tech experience in the armed forces at the time of the Kennedy autopsy, and there was no questioning or testimony asked or answered about how extensive his own X-ray experience was at the time as it relates to gunshot wounds. Nevertheless, 35 years later, and the permanent nature of those x-rays, fixed for all time at the moment they were taken, were still there for him to apply the knowledge and experience gained in all those 35 years. He is not a doctor trained in radiology, and we have to keep that in mind. And as a tech, he is not licensed to read those x-rays. But 35 years of taking them and working with the doctors who are licensed to read them, along with his own formal training, leads to effective apprenticeships that should be given serious weight in this conversation. Custer also reviewed Ebersol's sworn testimony and made comments where he agreed and disagreed with what was said. Clearly, Ebersol was not accurate on certain details, some important and some not so important, but Custer agreed with certain things he said, so it seemed objective in terms of Custer's review of Ebersol's testimony. I would recommend that you listen to this in detail. We'll pick this point up when we discuss Ebersol and listen to his testimony. The one comment that he made about Ebersol's testimony that I found interesting is that he said he ignored basic physics and should have understood that a force must have come in from the front to do the damage that was done in the posterior of the skull. And Ebersol also stated that while he saw a metal fragment in the brain, it was not a portion of a bullet. Ebersol also stated that he took an x-ray at 3 a.m. Custer says that was flatly not true. Both of those statements were flatly false. Custer also disagrees with the idea that the portable machine available was not producing the same quality x-ray as the fixed machines. Again, there was more said about his testimony, but no need to add any more here. As laser-focused as Custer was on minute facts related to the autopsy, he seemed equally perplexed about the exact dates of his own employment for various employers. This ability to recall exact details of the autopsy some 34 years later, but at the same time, he could not recall basic time frames of his employment, even broad estimates he was struggling with. This exchange certainly did not add to his overall credibility. Although I can understand the relatively trivial nature of those facts compared to the intensity of the autopsy experience itself and how those events of that night and the next morning must have seared the details into his mind, possibly to be remembered forever. And maybe with a little help from the research community too. Help in jogging his memory and recalling certain facts. And after all, they did engage with him, and talking about it does bring back a lot of memories. I'm sure. Memories that he was forbidden to talk about, frankly, with anyone until the secrecy order was lifted. And that was many, many years later. Gerald Custer's testimony is now precious. It has preserved the story of the autopsy that night in a way that gives us a courageous glimpse into what really was going on at Bethesda that night. And what was going on that night might truly have been a haunted house. We need to know more to determine if that was really true. But after 3.5 hours with Gerald Custer, it's at least feeling real spooky to me. Gerald Custer died 3 years after giving this testimony. He died of a massive heart attack. If nothing else, it underscores how important it was to finally get to witnesses and let them tell their story. In his case, even when it was some 34 years after the fact. The secrecy orders surrounding the autopsy made the truth more opaque for a much longer time. But in 1997, with the help of the ARRB and its legal team, the world now has a better understanding of what was really happening that night at Bethesda. Thank you for listening to episode 77 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Welcome to JFK and The Enduring Secret. I'm your host, Jeff Crudell. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. Today's episode is episode 78. Well, we are slogging through the autopsy, aren't we? Just a little bit at a time. And the last 6 episodes, well, they were gripping, weren't they? Yes, I know, they were a slog too. Okay, new rule. 6 episodes on any one micro topic, by definition, now constitutes a slog, and not just a wander. But I do hope that the last episode, episode 77, helped to tie it all together when it came to Gerald Custer. And now, at this juncture, part of the missing link is to hear the other side of the story, the testimony of Custer's boss, radiologist John Ebersol, MD. That's what today's episode covers, and luckily, there is audio testimony for Ebersol, too. And if nothing more, it does contain incredible revelations. I think it was the moment of truth for Dr. Ebersol. I can't wait for you to hear it. Right from this horse's mouth. It's one big bombshell. And it's only for a moment. So listen carefully, and you won't be disappointed. He was guarded for a good amount of the testimony, but I think his conscience got the best of him, and thank goodness it did, at just the right moment, to tell the truth about one of the most important factual disputes in American history. Why this comment has been buried for so long is really emblematic of how well the true and the whole story of what went on that night at Bethesda can still be buried under the covers after all these years. So, stay tuned. And, thankfully for you and me, there's a couple of good things happening here in the presentation of this episode. First, Ebersol's testimony is shorter than Custer's testimony, thank goodness. And second, this time I have followed through and edited Ebersol's testimony down to a more manageable subset of pertinent comments. And third, I have also tried something new this time. A production approach for this episode that was more time-consuming and generally difficult for me to produce, but should be an easier format for you as a listener. And that is, during the audio portion of the testimony, as Ebersol is testifying, and where there are important things to point out in his testimony right at that moment, I pause his audio right there and make comment on it right then. Sometimes in that effort, I compare and contrast to things said elsewhere, making particular reference to the inconsistencies of Ebersol's testimony when compared to what we just heard from Custer. One very important fact that you should be aware of before you listen to this testimony is the timing of these depositions. When we hear Custer, it was 1997, 34 years after the assassination and almost 20 years past the expiration of the secrecy letters signed by all who attended the autopsy that night. Plenty of additional time to find more courage to tell the real truth, and also more time to potentially distort it by what others may have said in the meantime. Not only was it 20 years past the expiration of the secrecy letters, but it was also about 20 years after Ebersol had testified. So, candidly, Custer got the luxury of going last. He would see exactly what Ebersol had said, and perhaps, as I keep saying, benefiting from the usual risk that goes along with trying to recollect events that happened some 34 years later. Custer was also testifying to a group that now, in that era, was at least incrementally more interested in finding and making available the more messy truth of the autopsy. That is the Assassination Records Review Board, or ARRB. The ARRB in 1997 was the body before which Custer appeared and testified, and it was a completely different animal than the House Select Committee on Assassinations was in 1978. In Ebersol's case, he was a reluctant participant in the investigation conducted by the HSCA, and initially declined to testify before its lawyers. Thank goodness he eventually changed his mind, and in this episode, you will hear from him as to the reason that he did. Still, the approach to the autopsy in that review by the HSCA was fatally flawed. Led by Michael Baden, a highly respected forensic pathologist at the time, in retrospect, it was clear that there were major forces bearing down on this portion of the review. And to be fair, while it was not the first review of the autopsy that had been conducted after the Warren Commission report was published, it was the first one that had been done as part of a new and comprehensive investigation of the assassination as a whole. As we have pointed out so many times already on this podcast, issues that arose that weekend at Bethesda, the issues related to how generally the autopsy was conducted, the falsification of specific evidence that night, some of which you are now aware of through the most recent episodes, and the outright lying that seems to have taken place around a myriad of topics. Well, they are really beginning to add up. And then add on top of it the order of secrecy and its implications, and a myriad of other nefarious actions, and you have yourself a circumstance that was like a live third rail in 1978, the year that the HSCA conducted its review. If there was bad stuff going on in the autopsy, the only fingers that could be pointed would then be pointed right at the government, because only government personnel were involved in the autopsy. It was a politically untenable circumstance and a fight that I am sure Robert Blakey, who was chief counsel for the House Select Committee, the man who essentially headed up the HSCA investigation, it was a fight that he and others in authority at the committee level were simply not willing to take on. It might have detracted from and perhaps shattered any chance at nailing down the central theme, and that was that there was a conspiracy to kill the president. A conspiracy to cover it up would have to emerge as a separate topic at a later time. In this investigation, the implications of an autopsy cover-up on top of all of that were just too fantastic for the time and place that was 1978. So that sleeping dog would again lie still on the floor. There would be only one man on the HSCA medical forensics panel with courage enough to stand up very publicly and take the stage at that moment and dissent. Well, it was Cyril Wecht, the well-known forensic pathologist from Pittsburgh. David Lifton and others were deeply troubled as well with what had happened. They too, I believe, were just as outraged that the investigation didn't go deeper and further on the autopsy. You know, there is nothing much worse to point out a flaw in an investigation and then reinvestigate and then leave open the same criticisms again, or at least many criticisms that were there to begin with. And this is exactly what the HSCA did. They made progress for sure, but they stopped short of the goal line in terms of finding out the complete truth of the matter about the autopsy, which may still have very well been attainable at that moment in 1978. As I've mentioned earlier, we will get to Cyril Wecht's 1978 testimony before the House Select Committee, his dissenting testimony. And with any good luck, we will hear from Cyril himself commenting directly for this podcast. Keep your fingers crossed on that one. Okay, that was a bit of a wander. And back to this episode. Who was John Ebersol? Well, let me tell you just a few things about Ebersol before we get started listening to his testimony. That may help when listening. At the time of the assassination, John Ebersol was 38 years old, well into his naval career. He was a captain at the time, and he would finish as a commander. 15 years later, in 1978, he was a 53-year-old former Navy officer who was now a practicing radiologist in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Here is a little bit of the before and a little bit of the after about Ebersol. Dr. Ebersol was a Navy man for a good part of his life, a man who came from humble beginnings and in many ways personified the American dream. His father was an auto mechanic, proud, I am sure, of his son's achievements. Father Ebersol would bring a son into the world that would do groundbreaking things related to the operation of the first 2 nuclear submarines in the USA's emerging nuclear navy. In addition to that, his son had a prominent position in certain events that happened as part of the Mercury space program. And so this young Dr. Ebersol already had an impressive past before he got to Bethesda. He was selected by Admiral Hyman G. Rickover to serve as medical officer aboard the U.S. Navy's first two nuclear-powered submarines, the USS Nautilus and the USS Seawolf. And he was the radiologist for NASA that screened the Mercury 7 astronauts for Project Mercury. Not a bad resume. After his time on the submarines and his time associated with the Mercury project, Ebersol was assigned to the Bethesda Naval Medical Center, where he was completing his residency in radiology. He would eventually go on to become the chief of radiation therapy, training director for nuclear medicine, and director of the Radiation Exposure Evaluation Laboratory. He also eventually became chief of diagnostic radiology and chief of radiology. On a personal note, he raised a big family. He and his wife had 6 children, 5 boys and a girl. All in all, he spent 24 years in the Navy before retiring in 1970 and entering into the private practice of medicine. After retirement from the Navy, Ebersol settled in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where he established and directed the John Hale Steinman Cancer Center at Lancaster General Hospital. Upon retirement from medical practice, Ebersol pursued a lifelong passion in mystery novels and crime fiction. He traveled to England and attended conferences at Oxford University. He became an adjunct faculty at Franklin and Marshall College, and he taught a detective fiction course in the Etc. program. He was a founding member of the Orange Street Improbables, a group of mystery enthusiasts. Like most of the JFK witnesses, there is more to this man's story and life than the 15 minutes of fame that surround their involvement in this passion play. And we must always keep in mind the considerations that people make when they assess the risk of speaking out. As we now know, Ebersol was the radiologist responsible for the X-rays taken during the autopsy of John F. Kennedy on the 22nd of November, 1963, at Bethesda Naval Medical Center. Fortuitously, perhaps, he happened to be the acting chief of radiology that night at Bethesda because the actual chief was away on official business. That gave him the dubious distinction of receiving the call and being on point that night to participate in the autopsy, and by that circumstance, becoming the radiologist of record for the autopsy. So with that background, and without further ado, let's listen to episode 78 of JFK, The Enduring Secret.
Our witness before the medical panel will be Dr. John Ebersol. Mr. Ebersol, will you take the following oath, please? Do you swear that the testimony you are about to give is true to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief?
I do.
Please state your full name and address.
John Henry Ebersol, 1440 Hunsicker Road, Hunsicker, Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
What is your present employment?
I am Chief of the Radiation Therapy Section of the Department of Radiology at Lancaster General Hospital, Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Thank you. The primary questioner, the initial questioner of these for the medical panel will be Dr. Michael Bodden. Dr. Bodden?
Dr. Ebersol, we'd like to thank you for coming down. As we explained, the group here represents the medical review panel evaluating the medical aspects of the death of President Kennedy. Could you give any, and we appreciate your coming down to help us in evaluating these medical aspects. Could you give us any recollections that you have now of the condition of the President's body when you first saw it, and how you, your relationship to the dead body, what your function was? So your time there was.
On the day of the assassination, I was acting chief of radiology at the Naval Hospital, Bethesda. The chief of radiology was away on official orders, and as assistant chief, I was, in fact, the acting chief. I was requested by the commanding officer about 4:30 in the afternoon to remain on board in or near the autopsy room to give any assistance that might be required in the way of x-rays. I was present in the autopsy room from the time the coffin arrived from Dallas with portable x-ray equipment and 2 x-ray technicians. With the exception of the periods when I personally carried the cassettes containing x-rays to the x-ray department, which was on the 4th floor of the hospital.
This is probably the first factual dispute that Custer would have with this testimony. In fact, he did indicate that he had read this and disagreed with it. Ebersol did not by himself carry those cassettes containing the x-rays back to the x-ray department. Those were carried back by both Custer and Ed Reed. And I'm not surprised by that because rarely would a radiologist do that himself. That would likely be something done by the x-ray tech.
With the exception of those periods, I was in the autopsy room from the time the coffin arrived to approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, at which time my services were obviously no longer necessary and I left the hospital. Upon removing the body from the coffin, anterior aspect, the only things noticeable were a small irregular ecchymotic area above the right supraorbital ridge and a neatly sutured transverse surgical wound across the lower neck.
And a neatly sutured transverse surgical wound across the lower neck? Why would somebody have been suturing over the tracheotomy incision? That certainly wasn't done at Parkland. Where was it done? And why? Oh, and that first thing, a small, irregular ecchymotic area above the supraorbital ridge? Well, take your right index finger and place it right above your eyebrow. You can feel the edge, the ridge, right there. That's your supraorbital ridge. And they are making reference to an area that is just above that. And an ecchymotic area would be one that has blood accumulating underneath the skin. A bruise. He's not describing a bullet hole yet. Just a bruise.
As we turned the body in the autopsy table, there was a textbook classical wound of entrance. Upper right back to the right of the midline, 3 or 4 centimeters to the right of the midline, just perhaps inside the medial border of the upper scapula. Again, I'd like to emphasize this was a textbook wound. Round, smooth, purplish, no raised margins. The back of the head was missing, an irregular, messy wound.
Notice how he just said back of the head, not top of the head, back of the head. I'm not trying to split hairs here, but to the extent that the actual damage was done in the lower rear, any shot coming from a slightly elevated position in front of the car and to the right would have traversed through the head at a slightly downward angle. And so the exit would have been lower than the entrance if the shot were coming from the front.
At that point, we had a wound of entrance, i.e. the back wound, and no known wound of exit. So prior to starting the autopsy, we were asked to x-ray the body to determine the position, the presence of a bullet. We took several x-rays, skull, chest, trunk. These were taken in the autopsy room on the autopsy table. They were hand-carried by me in their cassettes to what we designate as Tower 4, the 4th floor of the hospital.
All right, once again, and I don't want to belabor this point, but I don't think he carried any of the cassettes containing the x-rays anywhere.
Handled by a darkroom technician, given back to me and taken back, hand-carried by me to the autopsy room. The initial films showed the usual metallic fragments in the skull, but no evidence of a slug, a bullet. This was a little bit disconcerting. We were asked by the Secret Service agents present to repeat the films and did so. Once again, there was no evidence of a bullet. For those of you, I assume you're familiar with portable X-ray equipment. It's not the type of equipment that gives us fine diagnostic detail, but it is certainly very adequate in picking up any heavy metallic fragment. It will stand out like a sore thumb, either intact or shattered. The autopsy proceeded, and at this point I'm simply an observer. Dr. Humes, probing the wound of entrance, found it to extend perhaps over the apex of the right lung, bruising the pleura, and appeared to go toward or near the midline of the lower neck.
I think he may have forgotten one minor detail. At the very moment that probing began by Humes, and it's very well documented in the Seibert and O'Neill report, that in fact they thought that the wound did not transverse the entire body. In fact, it was a shallow wound. And he's making no reference to that at all here. And I think that's telling.
I believe by 10 or 10:30, approximately, a communication had been established with Dallas, and it was learned that there had been a wound of exit in the lower neck that had been surgically repaired.
Well, he's just dropped a bombshell, as you know. Humes has maintained throughout this whole process that he didn't know that there was a wound of entry or exit in the front of the president's neck. At least he didn't know until after the autopsy was over. Well, this statement now by Ebersol is one more that clearly contradicts statements by Humes. But oh, what a web we weave. Now, Ebersol is indicating that the communications from Parkland are also articulating that they actually surgically repaired the tracheotomy wound prior to the president leaving Parkland. To my knowledge, there is no such evidence that that occurred. So whether or not this is something he was told, or whether or not this is something he heard firsthand, well, either way, it's probably not true.
I don't know if this was pre-mortem or post-mortem. But at that point, the confusion, as far as we were concerned, stopped. The only function that I had was later in the evening, early in the morning, perhaps about 12:30, a large fragment of the occipital bone was received from Dallas, and at Dr. Fink's request, I x-rayed this. These were the last x-rays I took. The x-rays were taken by the Secret Service that evening. I did not see them again. And I must be a little bit vague on this point, but sometime within a month of the assassination, I received a call from the White House medical staff, a member of the White House medical staff, Captain James Young. Dr. Young asked me if I could review the skull x-rays for the purpose of getting some measurements for a sculptor. I said, yes, I thought that was feasible. I was driven to the White House annex where I did see the skull films and took certain measurements, and in taking those measurements may well have drawn lines on the film.
Wow, the web just keeps getting bigger and bigger. He drew the lines a month later while doing this work to develop a bust of the president? Well, that's a wildly divergent story versus what was articulated by Custer in his sworn testimony. Custer said that night during the autopsy that Ebersol placed those x-rays on the film viewer and began to make pencil marks on them, and he was directed by members of the gallery to stop. All I can say here is I don't think this is a problem with one or even two vague recollection of memories. These are two distinctly different stories that each tells with equal ferocity. So which one is telling the truth? I think that's really the only question that we have to answer here.
In summary, I'd like to emphasize one thing. these films, these X-rays, were taken solely for the purpose of finding what at that time was thought to be a bullet that had entered the body and not exited. If we were looking for fine bone detail, the type of diagnostic exquisite detail that you want in life, we would have taken the pictures in the X-ray department, made the films there. But we felt that the portable X-ray equipment was adequate for the purpose, i.e. locating the metallic fragment. In examining those films, such fine things were obvious as myelogram dye from a previous myelogram, with traces still present in the spinal canal.
The mentioned and related explanation of this myelogram is actually significant. Custer mentioned it too, but unfortunately his explanation was not expansive enough, I think, for everyone to really understand the significance of it. If you recall, Custer told us that one of the reasons that he was able to conclude that one of the individuals in the gallery that night, one of those individuals who was directing the autopsy, was the president's personal physician. And how he was able to conclude that is that Admiral Berkeley had previous knowledge of the myelogram that had taken place. In this current set of X-rays, the contrast dye or contrast material that was present during that myelogram was still visible. And when Dr. Berkeley mentioned it, it was clear that he must have been President Kennedy's personal physician in order to have such knowledge.
I did not testify at the Warren Commission. I have not testified or given witness to any official body except this one. I have been contacted by the usual sensation seekers and authors during the years, but have not made any comment, except on one occasion, when a fellow radiologist at the Rocky Mountain annual meeting, Radiological Society annual meeting in Denver, made the statement that a radiologist was not present at the time of the autopsy. This is Dr. Morgan from Johns Hopkins. In writing to Dr. Morgan, I stated that I certainly was present and gave him my qualifications. I did not receive an answer.
Thank you, Dr. Ebersole. A couple of questions relative to what you brought up. We have with us the X-rays in the archives, numbered 1 to 14. Do you remember, including the X-rays of the fragments that were brought up later, do you recall if those are the numbers of X-rays that you had placed in the archives?
Yes.
When you placed the X-rays in the archives, were you satisfied that they were each and every X-ray that you took? Is there any possibility there are additional X-rays that you did not see when you put the X-rays in the archives?
No, I feel those were numbers we took on which there were images.
And did you take X-rays in which there weren't images? Or?
It may have been possible that at the most one film had no image on and was destroyed.
Okay, but there were no X-rays other than the ones that were put into the archives.
This is a good place to make a point, and it's also a good place to make a correction. When we talked in the last episode about the number of missing X-rays, well, I missed one. There was a total of 3 X-rays which Custer identified that he took that were now no longer in the archives. The official number of X-rays are now 14, and if you'll recall, Custer said somewhere between 14 and 20 were actually taken, and by the end of his testimony, he had summarized that actually there were 3 missing X-rays and not 2. And I'm sorry because I mentioned only 2 in the last episode. The 3 missing X-rays include the 2 tangentials that we talked about already, and there was another AP cervical, which showed bullet fragments at C3, C4. That one was also missing. If you add the 3 missing X-rays to the 14 that are in the archives, that's 17 in total. And that falls squarely within the range of total X-rays, which Custer said were taken that night.
Do you recall when you took the X-rays, in the sequence of taking X-rays, and you took the X-rays of initially before any incision was made in the body?
That's correct.
You took the head, chest, abdomen, extremities?
Right. The order was skull first, then chest, then Trump.
I see. When Colonel Fink came in, these had already been taken?
Yes, and repeated once.
Now, when you say repeated, were x-rays repeated after the autopsy had started? Do you have an independent recollection of that?
The second group of x-rays were taken either before the incision was made or very shortly thereafter.
Maybe your memory be refreshed as we go through the x-rays. Some comment had been made in the past about total body x-rays being taken and the fact that the hands and feet aren't on these x-rays.
Right.
Did you take x-rays of the hands, feet?
No, we did not. We thought the films we took were adequate for the purpose for which they were taken.
When you first saw the body on the x-ray table, apart from yourself and Doctors Humes and Boswell, were there any other physicians who in any way participated or officially observed the autopsy?
No. At that time, to the best of my knowledge, only myself, Dr. Boswell, Dr. Humes were present. Dr. Fink was to arrive later.
Dr. Fink arrived later. Now, you mentioned that the tracheostomy was sutured when you first saw the body. The tracheostomy.
There was a sutured wound, a transverse wound at the base of the neck.
Do you remember any other sutured wounds?
No, I do not.
Sutured incisions that might have been...
No.
Do you know how Dr. Fink came to the autopsy room?
I believe Dr. Humes... I believe Dr. Humes contacted him by telephone after things had started and asked him to meet it.
And do you know, or did you discuss, or do you have personal knowledge at the time of doing the examination whether there were any strictures as to the extent of the autopsy, or was the manner in which the autopsy done purely a decision made by the physicians there?
To the best of my knowledge, there were absolutely no restrictions, and it was Dr. Humes' decision as to the extent of the autopsy.
I'm not a mind reader, but listening to that and listening to his intonation, the way his answer just sort of tailed off at the end, I don't know, there's something about it. It's quite telling to me. Again, as a juror, I think the question is he telling the truth? This is certainly in conflict with what we heard from Custer.
When the body arrived and was taken out of the casket, do you recall, was there a plastic bag around the head, or?
I don't recall. I was there when it was open. I don't recall a plastic bag, no.
Now, what's interesting about this is that this testimony took place before Custer's, which means that somebody else had already talked about that plastic bag. So, is Custer telling the truth, or did he co-opt somebody else's story? Which one? This is somewhat fantastic, I know. So, again, as a juror, you have to make the call.
Did you have any impressions or concerns about possible soft tissue movements in taking the x-rays of the scalp tissues?
No, I personally held the head for the scope position and kept my hands in it.
Okay. I'm going to show you some of the x-rays and perhaps we can go over one by one, but does anybody have any comments, questions? For the record, at that time that you did this, what was your position at Bethesda officially?
I was a commander, Michael Corps, United States Navy, assistant chief of radiology, and head of the radiation therapy nuclear medicine division.
When had you gone to medical school?
University of Indiana Medical School, graduated in 1948.
And then you've been in the military for how long?
I entered naval service July 1949.
And your position was as you described at the time of the shooting of President Kennedy?
From 1949 to 1959, I was associated with nuclear submarines and had special training in nuclear physics, Duke University in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. I commissioned and served on USS Nautilus and USS Seawolf, the first two nuclear submarines. When Seawolf was decommissioned in 1959, I started a residency in general radiology at Bethesda. I completed that residency in July 1963. At that time, I became chief of the radiation therapy and nuclear medicine sections. In December 1963, I was board certified by the American Board of Radiology at the Cincinnati examination.
Now, one other point before we get to the x-rays, which are on the view box. Some mention has been made to our committee about Dr. Humes asking who's in charge at the time of the autopsy, when he started the autopsy, to the persons in the autopsy room. Do you recall that specifically or anything like that? Comment that might have been made of that nature?
No, I don't recall, Dr. Button, any specific question. Dr. Humes might well have directed that to the many people who were milling around the autopsy room who were Secret Service agents, White House staff.
Well, what do you make of his response here? He doesn't recall, although Dr. Humes may very well have made that sort of inquiry to the individuals who were there that night, milling around, Secret Service agents, folks from the White House. I don't want to color anyone's view of this, but based on everything I've heard him say and how he answers questions, I think this happened. I think Humes did ask that question.
But there was no clear impression that you had that somebody in that room was in any way giving orders as to how the autopsy should be done.
Now let's pivot to another topic. Do you remember back during the last episode when Custer described that small metallic device that he used as a personal identifier? It was one of the ways he was able to assure that the x-rays he was looking at were actually ones that he had taken back in 1963. You may also recall at the time that Ebersol became aware that he was using it during the course of taking those x-rays, and he ordered him to stop. Well, now you get to hear Ebersol answer the question as to whether or not he can identify that item on the x-ray. It's been a long time since he's seen those x-rays. I'll give him that. Maybe he did forget.
Perhaps will measuring device or radio opaque.
It's a metallic rectangular object, but I can't identify it now. It looks as if it could be used as a measuring device, yes.
Okay. Perhaps...
Dr. Biden, did you state the x-ray you were
X-rays 1 and 2. And it's also present on x-ray number 3.
All right, next item. Do you remember Custer describing that moment at which the emulsion on the one x-ray, the skull x-ray, was burned right through, and Ebersol did it? And it just happened to be right at a spot where they saw fragments? Well, in this next little clip, you get to hear them ask Ebersol how this might have happened. And you get to hear Ebersol's response.
I'm looking on film number 1. You see there are 2 artifact points. Could you describe those and indicate what you think they do to?
These are raised, blistered, rounded areas on the X-ray film due to overheating the emulsion and probably coming about from placing it on or near what we call a hot light. Imagine a photoflood bulb and this place too close to it. Associated with these 2 areas, there are wrinkling in the film base, which also occurs when they are closely applied to a too hot a source.
Do you have any knowledge as to when and how they occurred?
No, I don't. They may well have occurred that night. I may have been the guilty party here as we were looking at these under bright light that night as well as under standard view boxes.
Okay, if that wasn't uncomfortable enough, let's go back one more time and ask him about those pencil lines on the skull x-rays.
Now, Number one, do you recognize the 3 skull X-rays, 1, 2, and 3, as the ones you had taken?
When I last saw these, I personally fixed some metal tape to them. Was that on these at any time? Yeah, there we go.
The red metal tape, numbered 1, 2, and 3. You said a lot.
These are the films.
These are films that you took,
yeah,
and that you put into the archives later.
Right.
Now, in fact, on number 2, there are some lines, some penciled lines. Are these the lines you, I think the other side, that you refer to as having?
Yes. On number 2 specifically, this is a line that I made. Identify definitely the lower line running from the nasion, N-A-S-I-O-N, to the occipital area. There is a second line at an angle to that first one, which I also made. The attempt here was to get a line from the high point of the forehead back to the occiput.
And that was for purposes of, as you understood it, a sculptor's request?
As I understood, this was requested, this was information that might be of use to a sculptor in making a bust.
You know, I don't always try to save the best for last, but sometimes it does just work out that way. And what you're going to hear next really is the best, and I have saved it for the end of this episode anyway. What you are about to hear is so fantastic that it requires no introduction. But what it does require you to do is to listen very carefully. This was a man who was faced with one of those important questions. This was also a man who hadn't told the entire truth throughout the course of this testimony. And yet, in many ways, how he answers this next question is more than a bit of redemption. I think for Ebersol, this really was his moment of truth. So let's listen to it.
Do you, on examination of these films, have an opinion as to where the gunshot wound of entrance was in the head, radiologically?
My opinion would have come from the side on the basis of the films. I guess all that can be said from the films at this time.
Thank you for listening to episode 78 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. Hello, everyone. The light of the new sun, today's sun, it's just pooching up over the horizon here in Atlanta. It's the familiar light of the early morning here. Only today is Christmas Eve. Today, tonight, and tomorrow carry a special aura about them for many of us. And this entire holiday season, no matter what faith you follow, carries special meaning to each of us. You know, regardless of your faith, we are all humans. We are alive. We breathe, we think, we feel, we experience pain, we experience joy. We try to make sense of it all. We do our best to carry on. You know, the onslaught of COVID these past couple of years has challenged many, and maybe most of us, to really make sense of it all. And COVID is but one of the many human challenges that are front and center, really, every day for so many people in this world. You know, over Thanksgiving, I watched a Christmas season classic. It was a movie that I hadn't watched in a very long time. Frankly, I'd forgotten the details of it. Most of you know it. It's the movie entitled It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart as the star. If we could all rewind the tape and get to see an alternative version of our lives, see what things would be like if we just done some things differently. Or in Jimmy Stewart's case, what would have happened if he hadn't been there at all. For Jimmy Stewart, it was the validation that his life really was a good one, a life well lived, that his being here really did make a difference, and that his goodness helped others to be better. For some of us, the query might not be so dramatic. It might just be a simple what if? What if things had been different? What if this one thing had happened in our lives or not happened, as the case may be? How would it have changed the course of our own life and the life of those around us? The inspiration of that movie and the simple revelation that comes with its message, it's been universal for almost 75 years now. That's why it's a Christmas classic, and that's why it's still available for viewing every year at this time of the year. For me, I have those thoughts often as I look back now. But I cannot change the past. I know that. But I can change the future. The future is still up to me here, as I am still living and breathing on this good earth. And remember the words of JFK, that God's work here on earth is left to us. I have come to disproportionately embrace two more earthly feelings beyond my religious faith. They are love and hope. For these two feelings seem to be the engine of my own direction forward. They are what keeps me moving toward the light of the day and pointed away from the darkness of the night. You know, even Scrooge on Christmas found love in his heart. He too had the kind of revelation that Jimmy Stewart had in It's a Wonderful Life, that a world without love is a world devoid of joy. And I truly believe that love is a prerequisite for hope. Love in your heart creates the cradle for hope, and hope rescues us when it seems that all is lost. And it can be like rocket fuel when you find yourself in one of those very rare moments in life when something extraordinary seems like it's now within reach, something you never thought could be, something that you perhaps waited patiently for your whole life. And now here it is within your grasp. Suddenly, hope ignites the spirit within, and we bloom once again in life. Hope is what might just bring you to the moment where you get a chance to seize the day. Your own carpe diem. In one short sentence, hope is a gift like no other. Hope works for us in other ways too. When all else seems lost, hope rescues the day. I want to share one message of hope like that has come out of this podcast, actually. Several months ago, Joy Huber found the podcast and began to listen intently to the story that I was telling all of you, the story of JFK, the enduring secret. It was really at that moment in the early stages when the audience for this podcast was smaller, and really we were just beginning to get some traction. Joy found us, and her story is sensational, and I want to tell some of it right here on Christmas Eve. A moment when our lives should be full of hope, hope for the future, and Joy is a perfect purveyor of hope. She won't need to rewind the tape and do something differently because what she is doing is changing lives for the good. It's creating hope. Joy Huber, at the age of 33, was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. She is now a cancer survivor. Like most people with cancer, that's a real pause in life. It's a moment where hope is needed to nourish the mind and the soul so that the body can endure enough to survive the attack and with God's help can bloom again. Joy was given that gift, and after her cancer experience, she wrote a book about that experience with cancer, and it was entitled Cancer with Joy. You can easily get the book from many sources. Just Google it. One day as Joy was listening to my podcast, she got the idea for her own podcast, but she was worried that the idea of producing a podcast might be too much. Still, she was determined to explore the idea because, well, she knew that having her own podcast that could reach those going through the cancer experience, it would be a help. It would bring hope. Hope to those who might be on the precipice of losing this most essential of human things, this thing that feeds the soul. Hope. She could bring knowledge, experience, empathy, approach, and share her personal journey to others that were on a similar journey that, well, by definition, is not one that most people have any past experiences with. So one day, on a long ride in a car on my way to Pittsburgh from North Carolina, I got a phone call from Joy. It lasted about an hour. After a brief introduction, she asked me question after question about starting a podcast, and I did my best to tell her what I knew and to give her some guidance, the best I could, based on my own limited experience. I knew immediately upon meeting her over the phone that she had everything it took to be a great podcaster and make a great podcast. It reminded me a little bit of that scene in The Wizard of Oz where Dorothy reassures. All that was needed was a sense of confidence to move forward. Her sense of hope and confidence to act on it. That was all that was needed to help catapult her forward so that she could create this podcast and generate so much hope for others. Well, the short story is that Joy Huber has done just that. She created a sensational podcast. The name of that podcast is Dose of Joy, another clever name that contributes to turning the fear of cancer into the happiness of life and hope. If you or someone you love or care about is going through a cancer experience, I recommend that you listen to this podcast or recommend it to the loved one and or family members who are on the cancer journey. It's a guiding light from someone who has been there, one more real beacon of hope. You can find Joy's podcast on all the major podcast outlets. I like to think that this is one more tiny legacy of the last year, one more tiny legacy associated with JFK, the enduring secret. That maybe if I would have rewound the tape and done something differently, that Joy's podcast might not have come about. Or at least it would have been left to other forces in the universe to inspire Joy to give this gift of hope to others. Regardless of the hypothetical, on this Christmas Eve, it's but one more example of hope delivered from the cradle of love in our heart. Thank you, Joy. Thank you from the cradle of our hearts. This podcast, JFK, The Enduring Secret, has been a wander inside of a journey. It's a journey I'm thankful for sure. The making of it didn't start out as a bucket list item for me, but it's now surely become one. I don't really have a bucket list per se, or at least I didn't until I started making this podcast. I guess it became item number one. It's not complete yet, this podcast series, but we are actually barreling toward the first anniversary. And when I checked the records earlier this week, I realized that we hadn't published the first episode until January of 2021. It's a correction of sorts for storage in my own mind, as I have recently stated that we started publishing around the holidays last year in 2020. That's not quite true. So truly, as we come to the end of 2021, we are closing in on the end of Season 1 of JFK, The Enduring Secret. 79 episodes and about 150,000 downloads so far. It's a good start. I want to give a special thanks to all the listeners this year who reached out personally to me and became part of the podcast family. I've had personal interactions with many of you, and those moments have been rich with collegial joy as we explore this topic together. A special call out on this Christmas Eve to Tony C., one listener from the UK who has become both a fan and a friend. Tony, wherever you are today and tonight, I want you to know that your friendship and your thoughtful comments about the podcast have been a gift to me and have provided me with hope and energy to carry on this bucket list wander that I call JFK, The Enduring Secret. So thank you for that. I'm looking forward to Season 2 in 2022. There is lots more to come, I promise. And if I can, I'll publish a few more episodes to close out 2021 before we make the pivot to the new year. Before I close, I have one more very personal shout out to the Bauer and Newport families in Pittsburgh. In this past year, indeed these past couple of years, they've shown courage and love as a family that is, well, extraordinary. They are the epitome of love and goodness and hope, and they have made a remarkable contribution to my own well of hope for the future. As we look forward, my wish for you, all of you, each of you, is that what you cradle in your heart, what you hope for, well, my wish for you is that it will come true. That on this Christmas Eve, your prayers will be answered, that your dreams will become a reality. That soon enough, before hope runs thin, that what you want most in your life will come true. God bless you, and I wish you a wonderful Christmas Eve and a Merry Christmas.
I really can't stay.
Baby, it's cold outside.
I gotta go away.
Baby, it's cold outside.
This evening has been
hoping that you dropped
so
in.
very nice.
I'll hold your hands, they're just like
My
ice.
mother will start to worry.
Beautiful, what's your
My father
hurry?
will be pacing the floor.
Listen to that fireplace
So
roar.
really I'd better scurry.
Beautiful, please don't
But
hurry.
maybe just a soda pop
Put
more.
some records on while I
The
pour.
neighbors might think,
Baby, it's bad out there.
say, was that a wink?
No cabs to be had out there.
I wish I knew
Your
how
eyes are like starlight
to
now.
break this spell.
I'll take your hat. Your hair looks swell.
I ought to get home for dinner.
Mind if I move
So
in
it's
closer?
time for me to cast you aside.
Oh, what's the sense of hurting my pride?
I really can't say.
Baby, don't hold out. Baby, it's cold outside.